Welcome back to Level Construction. Now that Logan has got all of the BSP in place for the shell of our level, it's time to move our attention over to static meshes. Remember, it's static meshes that put the detail into our level. So in this video, Logan's going to kick things off by first focusing on getting some static meshes in place for our floors, and then move on to some structural meshes so that we can start setting up walkways and all. Now we're going to break this up over multiple videos just so that we can keep things easy and keep our videos from becoming too long. So with that, Logan, let's get started.
Alright, to begin with, let's load up a package that has some of the floor meshes we'll need. I'll open up the generic browser and let's load in the LT Floors package. So let's jump over. There is LT Floors. So let's load that up and let me change my display back to, I guess the material doesn't matter because I'm about to turn materials off and switch to static meshes.
Okay.
So let's show static meshes for a resource type, and let's make sure we have that LT Floors package selected. And if we scroll down somewhat, we should find at some point in here we should have some tiles. There's a tile floor, broken 4x4 and 4x4B. Let me start with the 4x4 mesh. So let's make sure that that's selected. Let's jump into our level looking at this far edge, so this upper edge near the ceiling, or excuse me, near the floor, and let's add in a new static mesh, the tile floor. And let me turn on static mesh display. I've currently got the flag toggled off, so I'll hit W and make sure I'm showing static meshes. And I'm going to align this one up into the top right corner. So if we look at it in perspective, we can see that it is in fact going up to the very edge of the BSP. And then we just start duplicating. So we want to cover this whole floor with this kind of tile.
Now, are we pushing that actually up through the wall?
We are, but that's for alignment on the other side. It's just kind of a compromise since this doesn't fit exactly inside of the level. So I'm going to push it through the wall a little bit. It might even push through a wall a little bit on this side. It's just kind of a compromise.
Okay.
So let's duplicate this one off. Select both of them so we can duplicate again. Maybe grab the last one, duplicate it to get it far enough to this side. And then we can grab all of them. And we can duplicate across. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit as I move these to make sure that I get them lined up. And we're not going to need ones on the outside, so let me Control deselect that one. And duplicate these off one more time. Let me zoom in a little, just make sure that these stay lined up. And then duplicate one more time to finish filling out the map here, because these go through the wall a little bit on this side as well. And now we need to make sure we duplicate a few more so we catch these areas of the alcove. So if we look in here, we've got a little bit of the floor still uncovered. So I can grab these three on the top side, duplicate those over. That fills in that side. We had already duplicated enough to get this alcove filled in, and that should just leave this one on the far side. So if I take the top view down a little bit, let's grab these two and duplicate them down, and that has our floor filled in. Now just to break things up a little bit, make the floor look a little bit interesting, I'm going to select some of the tiles of the floor and replace them with a broken version. If we look at the generic browser for a second, we've got this other version that has some of the tiles missing. Let me actually select that since I'm going to just change this from the properties. So I'm going to make sure that the tile floor broken is selected, and then I'm going to select a few tiles, maybe moved over a little bit. Really any few random tiles on the floor will work. I'm going to grab these four, and I'm going to hit F4 to bring up their properties, so that I can go to the static mesh category, expand the static mesh component, and go all the way down to the bottom. And if you remember, of course, we have that second mesh, the one with the missing tiles, selected in the generic browser. So I could just hit Use, and we will apply that mesh, or rather we'll change that property so that now I'm pointing at the missing tile mesh.
Very nice.
So if I deselect these, we've got a nice kind of breakup, so it makes the floor look more interesting. And now, really, I think we can move into some of the structural stuff. We can take a look at maybe putting in some catwalks up for the second floor of the level.
Okay.
So for those catwalk pieces, I'm going to jump back into the static mesh browser, and I'm going to load up a package with some walkways. As a matter of fact, I think the supports, let me see, the floors actually might have that mesh. Let me just scroll down, and it does. These are the walkway pieces that I want to build that second level catwalk out of. As a matter of fact, I'm going to start with this one, this 90-degree angled corner piece. It's a walk pipe 01. So with this selected, let me go to the corner of the map right before the drop off into the slime room is, and I'll add this mesh to the floor, and I'll worry about its alignment here in just a second. Now I'm going to worry about the Z alignment first, since the idea is that I want this mesh to be aligned at the exact center of the room. You can see we've got the ceiling and the floor of the main room, or at least that's the level at which they reside. And I want to make sure that these walkways are placed at the exact center, so that when we start doing things like frames around the outside, that everything matches up evenly. Now, it's tempting to think that this major grid line is the exact center, but if we look at the ceiling really close, we can see that the ceiling doesn't lie on a grid line. So we're actually going to need to do some measuring to make sure we get this lined up right.
At least not on a major grid line.
Exactly. So what I want to do is go from the floor up to the ceiling, and let me move the view a bit so I've got everything in view. And measuring this, we do in fact have 512 units, which is what we intended by making the walls that tall. But we want to find the midline, and half of 512 then is going to be 256 for a midline, and that major grid line is at 240. We actually need to go up another 16 to make 256. So really, when we go to align everything up, we need to make sure that we hit 16 units above this darker grid line.
Okay.
So to do that now, I could take this mesh and move it up. Let me zoom in on, and notice where the pivot defaults to on this mesh. It's actually right in between, which is very convenient for aligning this up. So there's the major grid line, and we know that we need to go 16 units above. So there we go. And we have the mesh centered nicely in the vertical space in the room. Now we can worry about its positioning horizontally. So we'll make sure that's aligned off of the walls. Now, before I align this corner piece too much, I want to put the railing in place. Since all of these walkways are going to have railings attached, some of those railings kind of stick out to the side a little bit and take up more space. So I'm going to place the railing for this mesh before I decide on its final positioning. So I'm going to jump back into the static mesh browser, and I'm probably going to need to look for a different package. I think there's a trims package that's going to have a bunch of railings in it.
Okay.
So if I load up, let's look for LT trims.
Up one? Wait.
Oh, whoops, I hit walls. That's actually not a bad thing because we're going to use LT walls here in the near future. But I would also like LT trims because that's going to have some of the railings that we need.
Okay.
So I'll load in LT trims, scroll around. I think those are the correct ones right there. There we've got the railing 01, but we want the curved one, which is actually going to be railing 01, curve 256. I think that's going to be the one for this specific piece. So I'll select that, and I'll add it in. I could add it from the top view, but I'll probably need to realign it slightly. Yeah, it's way off down at the floor. So I'll move this up and move the pivots, let's see, probably a little bit above. What I'm going to do for alignment on these is notice how we've got kind of a larger section at the bottom, big square kind of area. And I'm going to try to align that so that it encompasses the floor piece. So that looks like it should be correct in Z. Now I can move this back over here and try to line it up. This is a little bit tricky because it tends to stick out a little bit far on the inside. Actually, let me make sure I've got it not sticking through the mesh like I do. So move it back and then over to the side, and also check in perspective to make sure that it just hugs the edge and doesn't actually go through it, which means that it's generally going to have about 16 units off the edge in one direction and 16 off in the other. And then otherwise we'll align quite nicely. But with this mesh in place, I can now tell exactly how far away from the wall I need to be when I set these up. So that's in X, that's actually looking pretty good, because if we move it any more on a 16-unit grid, it'll probably drop it right through that wall. I want to keep it just outside of the wall on that side. Now on the other side, we've got this brush line right here. If I temporarily turn static meshes off in the top view, I want to look at this inner line, and I'll make sure that we have the same thing where we keep this on the inside. So I'm going to drag this over just so that we have it just enough to not go through it. Actually, I'll move it out just a little bit more, so we have roughly 16-ish units on that side. And that should line it up pretty nicely for this corner piece. Now I want to duplicate this a few times because the idea is that this is a piece of a walkway that kind of starts around here at the top of the slime room, turns in, goes down, across, turns, goes across again, then back across, and then finally to this little elevator area. So we're going to need to duplicate this mesh a few times to set this all up. I'm going to make sure that I also have both of these selected because I want to move the railing along with the walkway piece. Let's take care of this one at the top first. And since these are going to have to be rotated, I'll do most of the duplications by starting in rotation mode. So I can duplicate this off with a rotation of about probably 90 degrees in this one. Then switch back over to move so I can drag this up. Actually, that probably needed to be 180, so let me just rotate that a little bit more. And there we go. Now before I move it all the way over, since the floor mesh is already kind of dense, and if we move it up to the side, you'll see that it's very hard to eyeball how far to move it in Y so that it lines up. It's very hard to tell exactly where it should be. So what I'll do is I'll leave it aligned, or actually leave it stuck to the edge of the other corner piece for just a moment, because in doing that I can move it over and find exactly how it needs to be aligned. So now we can see that it's snapping perfectly to this one. And then when I go to move it to the edge, I can make sure I constrain to X before I move it, and that way I know that when I put a walkway in between them, that will have them lining up properly. And for this side, I'm going to do the same thing, just make sure that this corner is placed as close to the wall as possible without actually going through it. So if we look, that's right on the edge, then we can actually see in the top view where it's gone over, so we can take it and move it one unit back in, and that aligns it very nicely. So that's piece 1, piece 2. We can go in the other direction now. We can take this guy and duplicate him. We'll probably duplicate by rotating 90 degrees again. So I'll move him down, rotate it 90 degrees, right there. And then move, and then same idea for aligning them up. I'll make sure that they snap together before I move them to the other side, so I've got the edges lining up nicely. Then I'll take this piece and move it to the edge, and then the same idea with the kind of wall snapping, making sure that if we're looking at it here, which I'll stay from this view so this view kind of matches the top view, we can see that we've got it going through the wall just a little bit. That means that this brush line is in fact the wall, and I didn't mean to select the wall, but that's okay. So we can just reselect these two. Then drag in Y until we're just inside the room, no longer going through the wall. And then we can duplicate again. This time, let me jump back into rotation, maybe probably 180 degrees to flip it in the other direction. And once again, we'll make sure that these two snap together, constrain to an axis, in this case X, and move up. Now this one's a little tricky because we need to get the center of this brush aligned with the center of the little alcove. Now looking at it, it almost seems like this floor mesh works for alignment because we have, using this kind of diagonal line, we have one line, another line, that means the center should be about here. As a matter of fact, if I just go into measuring mode, let's measure. We've got 128 units that way, 128 that way. So yeah, this line makes the center line. And looking at this mesh, I believe this line right here is the center. As a matter of fact, it wouldn't hurt to measure to make absolutely sure. We can measure in 128 units, and then from the center is 128 units out. So that line right here where these the mesh lines kind of join means that that's nicely centered up on the alcove. So that has the fourth corner piece placed, and some of the railings along with it. Now what I want to do is find a straight section of catwalk to put in between each of these. So I'm going to jump back into the static mesh browser, and let's see, we need to jump back to the LT floors package and scroll down a little bit until we find the walk pipe meshes again. This time I'm going to grab walk pipe 02, which is a short straight section. So let's see, we'll begin, let's start with the section maybe between these two meshes here. So in order to get the height kind of correct, I'll right click on one of them and use that as the position to add the new static mesh into. And it looks like it may have just lined it up correctly in Z. It seems to be centering nicely on the existing railings. Let me actually get this rotated into place. And looking at the way it's rotated, I think I changed my mind. I want to do this one first just because the default rotation seems to be set up to handle that. So what I'm going to do is slide this over, check in perspective, make sure that the Z height is in fact matching, and it's looking good there. But now look at this. We've got a scenario where this static mesh has its pivot placed along one of the ends. So this end has the pivot, the other end does not, and the mesh at its default scale of 1 is too short to bridge the gap between the two meshes. Now what I want to do is come up with a scale, a draw scale, actually a draw scale 3D, that will scale this mesh to fill the gap exactly. Because if, just to show this off, we could set a scale of maybe 1.5, and we can see that that did in fact scale up in Y, but it scaled up too much. Now it's going through the mesh. And we could take it back a little bit, maybe to 1.1, but that's too little. So I don't want this to turn into a tedious guessing game. So what I'm going to do is come up with a calculation that will give me the correct scale for this size. And to do that, I'm going to need to know two things. First is the original size of the static mesh, and the other number is the gap that I'm trying to fill. Now I think this mesh was actually called something 256, which hints at its size, but just to make sure, I'm going to measure the mesh out. And looking at this measurement, we've got about 256 units. So we've got a 256 unit mesh, and we're trying to bridge a gap between the other two static meshes. And since things are getting a little bit cluttered, it's getting kind of hard to tell the difference between the meshes, what I'm going to do is select these three floor pieces, the two angles and the one I'm trying to size, and let me hide or show only the selected actors. That takes a bunch of the other stuff out of the way. So now I can more clearly see that the space we're trying to gap is this much space, which is 320 units. So we need to get the ratio between the two. And if I bring up a calculator, we could divide 320, the target size, by 256, and that gives us a scale of 1.25. If we plug that into the draw scale 3D for Y on our catwalk mesh, 1.25, look at that. We get a perfect scale fitting the size.
Excellent.
And snapped perfectly on the grid. So that's looking really nice for those two meshes. So I'm going to show everything, bring the rest of our meshes back, and we can start duplicating this across to some of the other sides. To duplicate, I'm going to jump to rotation, so I can rotate this in a duplication about 90 degrees, and then I can move it over in place for this other catwalk here. And if we look, how is the spacing? It looks like the spacing on that's already exact.
Yeah,
it looks like that happened to be 320 units. I could measure it, but I mean that's looking really good.
No, that
right
looks
there.
really good right there. Check the other side.
And the other side is the one that I snapped to, so it should be
yeah, there
right
you go.
as well. So that's working out really nicely. It leaves one space, and that is the space between these two on the far side, so I can just duplicate over and line everything up, zoom in a little bit to make sure that we're aligned on the one side. We could even visually confirm in perspective. But now we're back to a situation where we need a little bit more scale because we need to bridge the gap. And once again, just to make things clear, make the measure mode easier to see, I'm going to hide out everything except for these three brushes. So we'll hide or show only selected. And then we'll measure what the gap distance is going to be. So I'll go right next to everything, and I didn't mean to hit the scroll wheel, so we'll start. And yes, hitting the middle mouse button on this mouse is kind of
tricky.
Sometimes hitting scroll, but there we go. We're looking for a distance of 416 units. And of course we have the 256 brush, so we can take 416 and divide that by 256, giving us a scale of 1.625. If we plug that in here, 1.625, then we have everything lining up as it should.
Excellent. Very nice.
So now we can show all actors, and now we've got a catwalk that spans the entire length of the walkway. Let's see. Next, let's go and grab some more railings. Let's start fitting in railings across all the straight pieces of the mesh. So let's jump back into the static mesh browser, and let's jump back over to the LT trims package. And from there, I can't remember if it's up or down. I think it's up. There we have railing 01. Let me see. We've got railing 01 and railing 01 256. We're going to use, I think, these two. One of them has an end piece, one of them doesn't. I think the second one. We'll start out with railing 01 256B, because I think it's the one that has the end pieces on both ends. And I'm going to grab this middle straight section of floor, and we'll add in the railing static mesh. And we'll slide it over just a little bit. And looking at it, it's the piece that has ends on both sides. It is, however, facing the wrong way. So let's grab the rotation and swing it around 180 degrees. And then move it back into place. And let me also check the height. It's looking good in Z. It seems to be matching the height properly. And is now snapped in place. So that should work nicely for that side. Now we need to add railings. Let's see. I think I'll start with the outer railings now. Now it's tempting to just grab this piece and duplicate it to fill in this side, but the problem is this piece having a support on this side would look very nice joining this side of the railing that doesn't have a support, but on this side we'd have the supports doubled up. So what I want to do is find an alternate version of this mesh that is missing a support on one side so that it looks better when connected to this mesh. So I believe that is railing 01256, the one right before this one that we just added. So let me jump to the other side of the walkway and we'll add this railing in here. And scroll out a little bit, slide this into place, and yeah, we can see on this side those edges should connect really well. Let me move this out a little bit so that's the correct size. I think I need to move it up in Z just a little bit. Yeah, it's a little bit too far down, so we'll snap it up in place. Now let's see, I should be able to snap this side, so that looks really nice. But now we're in a scenario where we need to match in this direction. I'm going to try copying the scale off of the floor brush, but I think we might need to do some more accurate alignment. Let me copy the scale of 1.25 just as a starting point. And yeah, it looks like the railing is meant to be scaled a little differently. So what I need to do is find the points that I'm trying to gap, and we'll go back to measuring and calculating. To begin with, though, I think this was 256, so we'll know that's our starting point. And I'll also do the same thing I did before, where we'll grab only the relevant meshes, jump into a show only selected so we get a much clearer grid to align to. As a matter of fact, I'll even slide this one out of the way temporarily, just up to there. Because what I'm looking for is to try to get this edge to match up to this edge on the other brush. So that would mean that we're trying to bridge a gap of, let's see, edge to edge about 352 units. So let's see, 352 divided by 256 would give a scale of 1.375. If we plug that in, now we have something that looks a lot closer. But I think there's still a small issue within that. There's a little bit of overlap on one side. Now, I might not even worry about it here unless that can be seen, because I mean that's such a small amount.
Yeah, it really is.
If we absolutely wanted to get it lined up, we could always take this back, maybe down to 4, maybe down to 3. But the problem with pulling it back is we get that little gap in there, so it would have to be something like 310. But the other side is misaligned a little bit. What I'm probably going to do is leave it...
I just put a 2 there. Change that 1 to a 2. That should do it.
And 3.125. Just put it just a little bit on that side so we can never see through it. Now chances are, unless the level was extraordinarily bright, that we wouldn't even be able to see it. We could have left it at 0.375.
Sure.
But that's just showing if you want to get it exact, you can, of course, jump in, zoom in on it really close to get a nice alignment. But
yeah, that's good.
That now has that walkway. We can bring all of our other actors back. We've got a nice continuous flow going here where we've got this walkway without any noticeable gaps in the placement of those spacers, and then so on. So the next piece we can probably grab this piece itself and duplicate it, because we've got another support on this side, so the non-support of this one would look best aligned to it. So we could duplicate, I'll duplicate with a rotation, where we duplicate about 90 degrees, and then move it into place. So let's see, what would be good for an alignment on this side? Because I don't want it to overhang too far necessarily. Since when we go to set up this other side, I also want a piece sticking out through here. So I might actually leave the final alignment on this one to just a little bit later. And we could try to align it so it's dead center there. But I kind of want to push it back just a little. I think that looks good. Like I said, we may have to adjust it a little bit.
Sure.
I'll leave it right there and get the scaling set up on it. So in order to get this set up, let me grab just these two, and we'll show only those as selected. so I can find from this point on the edge how long it actually needs to be. That's 400 units. Let me think. If I slide it one more, where would be 368, 384? I'll go 384. So if we take 384 divided by 256, it gives us a scale of 1.5. So 1.5, and looking at it, we could do the very fine alignment, because I mean, the only danger is a little bit of possible Z-fight, but I mean, I don't see any flickering here, and deselected, it doesn't look bad. So I'm actually going to skip on this one.
Yeah, it looks good.
If we ever end up in a case, I mean, we can kind of see through on those sides, but at this point, it'd probably be rare that you could see through it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Well, I kind of don't like how those are kind of giving see-through rings on the side. We could pull it back just a little bit so that it doesn't do that. Do maybe 0.49, maybe 498, about 49, well, that's too much, 497.
There you go.
And that seems to have, that's fixed up. If you have to get that close, then you're just too close to the mesh.
Sounds fair.
So I mean, that's looking very nice. Chances are no one would have even noticed the scale we had before. 1.5 would have probably been just fine. But this just guarantees that we'll never have any problems with it. Alright, let's bring all of the meshes back now, and let's see what's next for getting a guardrail. We could probably set one up on the other side. As a matter of fact, I wonder if we could just reuse that scale and move it over to the other side. If we rotate, we need the this solid piece to be on the far end, which is fine, so we could just go into rotation. We could duplicate and rotate this around about 180 degrees and try to move it into place and just see how the length is working. This one might have to be a little shorter, but I won't know until I get it lined up. Yeah, this actually needs to be shorter, because I want to set it up looking at it on this side to make sure that those supports don't actually push through each other. So I'm going to align it something like that, just so that there's a little bit of a gap, but it's not anything that a player could fall through. And on this side now, we actually need to shorten the mesh. So for starters, I'll probably do a measurement just as a basis so that there's less guesswork. So we'll show only these two selected, and then get an idea of how far we need to go to hit that mesh. So starting from this side, if we measure in, we're actually looking for about, looks like 368 units. So if we do 368 divided by 256, gives us a scale of 1.4375, which I'm sure would have been loads of fun to try to come up with just trial and error. And do we have anything pushing through on that side? Just a little bit. So we could take this back just a very little bit, and maybe a little bit more. 70, let's take that to 65, maybe that down to just 60.
Cool.
And now we can't see anything sticking through on that side, but we still have enough overlap where we don't see a gap on this side. So let's once again bring all of our meshes back, and let's see. That's now looking good for that guardrail. What places do we have left? It looks like we've got 2 left for this piece. So looking at this side, we're going to need a guardrail for this side, seeing how we have a non-supported edge on this side, and we know we need a support for the corner. Let me grab this piece that has a support on both sides and duplicate that over. So once again, I'll do a rotation of 90 degrees in a duplication and move that into place. Let me zoom in just a little bit, and that needs to go there. As a matter of fact, there, now it's really easy to align. And bring everything back, and that's looking pretty good. It could probably stand to be scaled out a little bit. Like if it was 16 units more, it'd be even with this side.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good idea.
So if we scale that out, let's see. Let me see if I can get the measurement even with everything showing. We grab this guy, we know we're going to be scaling from here. We're actually looking for 16 more units. So there's 256. There's 272. Let me see what that would be in the scale. If we had 272 divided by 256, that would give us a scale of 1.0625. And really, for simplicity's sake, we could probably copy directly from calculator. If we did a Control-C inside of calculator, and then went into the Draw Scale 3D field and hit Control V. We could just paste the value directly across and not have to memorize it all the time. Should be kind of handy. So that's, yeah, that edge, see the flat edge here, the flat edge on that side, now matches up. So we've got much nicer scaling for the two guardrails. And that leaves one last guardrail on this side. And we could actually take this guy and duplicate him over, because again we have a case where we have the end pieces without a support post. So we could take this mesh and duplicate it across and see how it's aligning. And we'll need to spin it around, so we'll grab rotation, swing it around 180 degrees, and move it back into position. So now I can see where it needs to fit here. It looks like it needs to go out a little bit, so we'll snap it out. That edge is now snapping in properly. And on the far edge, let me think. We need the doorway mesh in place before we can tell what the snapping should be on this guy. But I could go ahead and drop it in, because I think this is the last guardrail piece.
Okay.
And I need a doorway in place here to be able to tell how wide it is. So I'm going to load in the actual doorway. So let's go to the static mesh browser. Let's load in a new package. This package will be LT doors. We've got LT doors, and we're looking for a mesh that's a simple doorway frame. So scrolling up, we can grab doors SM simple frame 01. We'll grab that mesh. And to get the height kind of approximated, I'll right click on one of the existing walkways and we'll add in the new static mesh. And we'll move it out to the edge, right about here, kind of align it up a little bit. I want this mesh to be a little thicker though, because what I want to try to do is align it up, because we kind of have this brush that makes a nice guideline for a wall. The idea is that by the end, once we have all the static meshes in place, the idea is to build a wall between these two rooms out of various static meshes. And I want that wall to kind of match the brush wall thickness of 32. And I'm actually going to consider this little frame, this doorway has a kind of square-edged frame on the outside of it. And I'm going to consider that part of the structure of this wall. But at the current scale, it's a little bit too narrow. As a matter of fact, it looks like it's about half the width of that other brush. So we could take this entire doorway and scale it out in Y and draw a scale 3D, maybe even by scale 2. And then if we zoom in, you can see that fills up the 32 space. So if we start with this as a reference, we'll end up with a wall that's 32 units in thickness. So now let me move it around just a little bit to get it lined up with the floor here. Move it down just a little bit, and I didn't mean to grab the manipulator, I meant to grab the viewport, but that's okay. We'll snap this back in, try to judge the center of this mesh. Alright, so we've got a center line there. This center line should snap in place. Let's go to a side view, or maybe even a front view, and set this up so we've got that near the bottom. That looks like it's snapping nicely. It's going to be a little bit lower than the catwalk, but that's alright, because otherwise if you move it up, it's a step up into it. And let's also take note of how this is aligning to the top. We're actually going to have to scale this up just a little bit, because you can see there we have our ceiling in BSP, and there's the top of our mesh, and it doesn't quite reach. So let's get an idea of what the scales are so we can find a scale that'll make it reach the top. If I measure out the brush, we've got a height of 240, and we're trying to hit a height of 256. So we need to scale it up a little bit. So if we take 256 divided by 240, that gives us a scale of 1.06 onto infinity. I'll copy the entire thing, and I'll let Unreal Ed worry about the rounding. So I'll paste this in for Draw Scale 3D in the Z-axis, and we'll let it round it down to 1.0667, and that's got plenty of accuracy to have us snapped up to that top wall there. So that's looking nice. Now with this doorway in place, I can see exactly how far I need to move this mesh over so that it matches the edge, which will kind of make it look nicer to not have a gap. As a matter of fact, I wonder if it's almost tempting to move it in instead of hitting this outer wall outcropping. Maybe just move it all the way in so it fills up that empty space. But at any rate, we know that that's a 256 mesh. We know we're going to that guy, so in order to clean up the view, let me show only these two meshes. Let me figure out what desired length I'm looking for here. So I'll measure out from the edge up until here, and that's 336 units. So 336 divided by 256 gives us 1.3125. We'll copy that, grab our guardrail, and drop that in for draw scale in Y. And that has us aligned nicely there. So we can bring all of our meshes back.
Very nice.
And that has everything lining up there. So let's see, is there anything else for walkways and guardrails here? We've got, let's see, this room. Let's see. To review this one, we've got all the walkways in place. Looking on the inside, we've got guardrails going all the way back, guardrails going all the way back around here, and off into the wall. I could fill in guardrails that actually stick out here. That might not be a bad idea. Well, we've got all the guardrail meshes out, because I want to make sure that this doesn't just end here, because that mesh really isn't designed to just end. So what I'll do is, let me grab, let's see, this one should work. Grab this guardrail, I'll duplicate it and slide it up here, rotate it into position, and then we'll snap it in place. And I'm just going to let this one slide right out into the wall, because it adds a kind of nice effect. See it just kind of fade off into the wall right there. So that works nice on that side. For the other side, I can probably use the same mesh. And let's see, let me duplicate it over down here. Now I don't want to rotate it, because I like having the pivot basing the positioning on this side. So instead of rotating it 180 degrees, I could grab draw scale in X and set that to -1 and just mirror it instead. That way I retain my positioning on this side. And let me find a good place to snap this into, because I kind of need to come up with a more of a corner alignment here. Let me look at it this way. We've got sit up there. Trying to find a good spot to align this to. Maybe move it over a little bit on that side. Yeah, I kind of like that, how that's aligning. And also it should be long enough to fade off into the distance. Now it's kind of, actually it's not really interfering with this one if you look at it. I mean, the corners, I don't know, would it look more, it might look more aesthetically pleasing if this was actually snapped in a little bit so that it wasn't so close to the edge. If it was actually moved down, maybe just like that even. Well, looking at it, it almost needs to be both. You almost need to move it in so that those don't coincide so badly. Let me see. Could even, let me see, if I had this moved back, where was it?
Something like that.
That's back to its original. That could be moved even more out of the way so it just doesn't interfere, and that makes a good corner. We could find another mesh to kind of fill in this little gap.
Sure.
As a matter of fact, I'm going to find two meshes. Since this is kind of a wide opening, the elevator is going to be closer to the size. It's going to be even more narrow than this walkway. I want to fill this in to create kind of the top of a platform. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find another mesh that's kind of like these railings, except it's just the support beam. It doesn't have the actual railings itself. Back in the static mesh browser under LT trims, if we find the railing section again, we've got the first railings that we were using. So we've got railings like this, but if we scroll down a little bit more, we've also got these railing pieces without the actual railing segments. So looking at these, we've got a longer one, a shorter one, and then a really short one. Let me start with the mid-length one, which is railing 01C. And let me drop that in. I think I'll use the short one and then the really small segment. The short one will go on this side, so let me find a good place to add this in. We add in railing 01. And let's see, if we move this off to the side, how long is that? You know, I might actually need the really long one to fit all the way in. Let me swap this out. I'm going to load up its properties and then drop down to the bottom here, static mesh. I'm going to hit the Show Generic Browser button so that I can select railing 01B instead, and then we'll use that from the static mesh browser. That should give us enough length to get that lined up. I mean, it sticks out of the level a little bit, but I'm not too worried about that. It does make sure that it's long enough to reach the end here.
Right.
Now for the shorter segment, we can probably go in and pick on railing 01D, the very short segment. And we can drop that into place here. And it looks like I need to move it down just a little bit. Let me grab, let's see, a front view would probably be best. Snap that down about 16 units, and then move it in, and align it so that it kind of sticks to the edge of that existing railing. Now, of course, that's too long to bridge that segment, and the actual space I'm looking for, if I measure it, is more of about 48 units. And its current length is, let's see, actually I need to measure from this side so I can see the length. So we've got 128 units that we're trying to fit into 48. So if we divide the target length of 48 by 128, that gives us a scale of 0.375, which we can copy into the draw scale.
There you
and
go.
Y, and that has a nice little connecting piece just to fill in the gap there.
Mm-hmm.
And really,
yeah.
Actually I probably need two of these looking at it. I need another one down here on this side. Because that way, because we've got railing,
yep.
railing, and then this piece filled in.
Mm-hmm.
So now I've kind of, it's almost like we're building a support platform for an elevator. So now something can be fit in here. We'll probably need to have a little bit more of a walkway in here, but I have no idea of what length is going to be needed to get to this imaginary elevator that we haven't added yet. So I'm going to leave that piece off entirely until we have the elevator, and then we'll know exactly how long it should be. Then we won't have a problem like we had with this mesh where we didn't know how long it should be.
Okay.
Alright, let me think. We just looking over this to see if we need anything more for this section. I think that's all of the catwalks for this first room, and it's also the doorway mesh itself, which is going to be the beginning of the wall pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's everything we needed to accomplish for the first room's walkways and railings.
All right, excellent. Well, with that, that is going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.